Today's sermon is called The Story of the Button, and if you think I'm not really going to tell you about buttons because, well, they're buttons, well then you're wrong. Ingeniously functional buttons with buttonholes for fastening clothes together were invented about 700 years ago. Most of us probably have a button on our clothing today, and there must be billions of buttons in the world. Today I'm going to tell you about two of those buttons, both of which I found recently while rummaging around in a box in our attic. Now, the first button story starts with my brother, who, in the grand tradition of older brothers, enjoyed making my childhood miserable. Aww. He once tied me to a tree and left me for what felt like hours, a few minutes really. And another time he donned a white sheet and with spooky lighting momentarily convinced me that my bedroom was haunted. And once, deciding to set off fireworks from his bedroom windowsill, he plucked out the eye of my stuffed bear and used the socket as a bottle rocket launching pad. Only a 10-year-old boy could think of something like that. Well, he was sorry when he saw how upset I was, but despite an exhaustive search, the bear's eye was nowhere to be found. But my mother promised me that she would fix my one-eyed bear. So the next morning when I woke up, there was the bear sitting on my pillow. During the night, my sewing-averse mother had made the sacrifice of sewing a button on in place of the missing eye, and it was a big button, so it covered most of the bottle rocket scorch marks. I was so grateful because thanks to that endlessly adaptive button, my bear could see again. And you know, I considered bringing that bear in to show you today, but after 30 years in a box, he's looking quite flat now. And a little creepy, too. Now, the second button I want to tell you about is right here. And it's also from that attic box. This one's gold and pretty fancy. This is a bigger story than the first, with some detours along the way. But in the end, we'll get to this button. And we'll encounter more buttons as we go along, like the ones on the shoes that Dorothea Dix fastened with trembling fingers one brisk morning way back in 1841. Now, normally, Dorothea's hands exhibited the steady, self-control characteristic of this child abuse survivor who had started her own school at the age of 14. A few years later, after embracing Unitarianism and its emphasis on social responsibility, Dorothea had begun running one of the first free schools for poor children in the nation. But none of these accomplishments stopped her from trembling that morning as the carriage stopped in front of the East Cambridge prison. "Why bother teaching criminals?" the townspeople had said. But Dorothea had retorted, "They're people too, aren't they?" But now, as her footsteps echoed through the bleak prison hallways, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Shivering, she asked, "Is it always so cold in here?" The warden didn't answer, and turning the corner, they passed by cell after cell where people were crammed together in filth and darkness. "How do you divide them up?" asked Dorothea, noticing a child almost lost amongst the legs of the adult inhabitants of a cell. The warden shrugged. "We don't." Outrage flooded Dorothea's body. Children, the mentally ill, and the intellectually disabled were all packed indiscriminately in cells with murderers and other violent criminals. All Dorothea had to do was see, hear, and smell how deplorable the conditions were. Conditions that left people feeling unwanted and without hope. But sometimes those conditions can be less obvious. I think back to over a decade ago when I sometimes judged a talent show at a Los Angeles nightclub. Yes, another life. The show's regulars ran a bizarre gamut from a 3-octave range singer to a woman whose dance partner was an ironing board. I never did figure that one out. Now, one night after the show, a smiling young man with dirty blonde hair and broad shoulders approached me. "I wanted to meet you," he told me in a voice tinged with a Texas accent. "Why me?" I asked. "Because I know a gentleman when I see one," he said, his eyes twinkling. And then leaning in, he added, Don't tell anybody, darling, but I'm one too. And he was. Loyal and steadfast. I could count on Henry. We were an odd pair, me the idealistic pacifist, and he the idealistic patriot. For Henry was a Marine. He told me, all I ever wanted to do is make some kind of difference in the world. I figured I could do that by serving my country. Once enlisted, he had come to painful terms with his sexual orientation, and the mandatory silence of don't ask but don't tell weighed heavily on the solitary young man who had lost both parents as a child. This is where I thought I'd finally fit, he said once. And now I know that if they find out, I won't fit anymore. He paused, his eyes losing their customary twinkle, and then said, maybe that means I already don't fit. He quickly changed the subject, telling me once again about the house he would someday build, every detail thought out. Though I'm not ready to pick out curtains, he'd say, giving me a sly glance. Unless you want to, darling. And I pretend I didn't know what he was talking about and tell him for the umpteenth time to quit calling me darling. And then we went to that talent show and laughed about the lady who danced with the ironing board. That was a long time ago. I hadn't talked to Henry for a while when I sent him an email recently, letting him know what I'd been up to. I completed a training program for both testing people for the HIV virus and counseling them on ways to reduce their risk for catching the virus. And 2 weeks into the job, I faced the biggest challenge I had known so far. Nothing had quite prepared me for that red line on the testing stick, telling me that the dark-haired 25-year-old man who sat a few feet behind me was indeed HIV positive. It had been a difficult counseling session. This man spoke in halting English, and though he said he had a wife at home, he was also part of an ethnic culture where anything other than heterosexuality is deeply frowned upon, and my instinct told me that his story wasn't the whole truth. Add the fact that he was an immigrant in a country that didn't do its best to welcome people of color, and it's no wonder he didn't feel comfortable sharing whatever the truth was. I could sense all those layers of oppression pressing down upon him, and how the resulting loneliness might have driven him to act out in ways sexually that put him at risk. And he would be the first person to whom I would be saying the words, "Your test came back HIV positive." Tough stuff. And it was tough stuff for Dorothea Dix after visiting that prison. That night she tossed and turned in her bed, the fetid prison air and the faces of the lost and lonely haunting her dreams. But by morning, Dorothea had determined what would become her life's mission: to improve the conditions of those who had been discarded by society, particularly those suffering from disabilities and mental illness. And she started by securing a court order that ensured heat and improved living conditions in the very prison she had visited. And that was only the beginning. Her fingers didn't tremble as she buttoned her shoes on subsequent visits to prisons. She had purpose now, and though tongues wagged about the woman who had the audacity to travel alone, Dorothea visited prison after prison, climbing down dark stone stairways to find the mentally ill chained in cellars suffering from malnutrition and poor ventilation. Even after countless visits to collect data, Dorothea would sometimes still have to stumble outside and catch her breath. My friend Henry, on the other hand, never quite seemed to catch his breath. Eventually, as he had feared, the military discharged him. And then his life was lived breathlessly. One job, one city, one relationship after another. At odd times over the years, the phone would ring and there would be that instantly recognizable drawl, "Hello, darling," followed by a whirlwind conversation. At one point, he was tackling social ills on some radical website. At another, he was mounting a campaign to go into local politics. Always, there was that desire to make a difference in the world. But more and more, he seemed cast adrift, as though the military discharge had launched him in a small boat onto the waves of an endless sea. But he'd always say, "Don't worry about me, darling, I've got big things brewing." Meanwhile, I was busy with the things brewing in my own life, like the challenges of being an HIV counselor, one of which was the client who had left a section on his questionnaire blank that asked for the number of sexual partners in the past year. "I don't even know how to begin to count," he said. We talked about why he hadn't used protection in any of those interactions. "Ever since I moved from my family back east, I've just been trying to have a good time." Quietly, he added, "I know I've got it." I was sure he would have it too as I forced myself to view the test results. And there wasn't even a ghost of a red line. HIV negative. When he heard the news, tears formed in his eyes. And as we talked, I realized that despite all those sexual partners, there was no one he could call a friend. And I thought back to the other people I'd counseled, the woman of color who had angrily told me that she didn't need counseling, but then talked nonstop about the isolation she felt in her own life. The low-income senior haunted by the fear of having caught something from the last close human connection he'd had, a fleeting tumble with a woman on the sofa 5 years before. The gay man whose spouse of 30 years had told him that he didn't want to be touched in any way, ever again. Loneliness. You could drink it in through your pores. It was so palpable in that counseling room.